Chapter 1. Molly slung her backpack off her shoulders and slowed her pace as Mike sauntered up to her side, panting like they'd just finished an Olympic race. "Are we gonna make it before the sun sets?" he asked, taking a water bottle from her and drawing the last drops from it, leaving only the soggy dock grass clinging to his lips. Molly nodded. "We're close. I can feel it." The mountain trail winds through dense dog forest, the trees forming a looming canopy overhead. The narrow path is slippery with fallen leaves, and the air is heavy with the scent of decay. A sense of unease permeates the air, a chill that sends shivers down the spine. Molly and Mike trudged on, their footsteps muffled by the crunch of autumn leaves underfoot. Molly, a strong and independent woman in her mid-20s, pulled out a faded, dusty camera from her backpack. "Look what I found along the way, can you believe it?" Mike shaded his eyes from the sun with his hand and glanced at the camera. "Cool find," he grinned. "Any idea who it might belong to?" Molly furrowed her brow, determination sparking in her brilliant blue eyes. "Not a clue, but I'm going to find out." Mike raised an eyebrow, chuckling softly under his breath. "All right, sleuth Molly. Do your thing," Mike said, playfully nudging Molly. Molly shook her head, ignoring Mike's teasing. "I'm serious, Mike. This camera is proof that somewhere out there is a person whose memories we're now carrying with us. And that's not something to be trifled with." Mike shrugged, acutely aware of Molly's intensity. All right, just don't get us lost trying to return it." The woods around them grew thicker, the trees creating a cocoon of shadow and mystery. Molly's thoughts swirled, her mind consumed by the unknown. She gripped the camera, examining it with a renewed sense of purpose. Molly felt a sharp pull on her arm and glanced at Mike. "Hey, let's break for lunch. I'm getting a bit hungry and the sun will be setting soon." She glanced at her watch, realizing he was right. Time had slipped away while she was engrossed. A flicker of frustration passed over her face, but she nodded and followed Mike to a small clearing. They settled on a patch of soft, vibrant grass. Molly set the camera carefully beside her as she pulled out a sandwich and an apple. As they ate in amiable silence, Molly's thoughts raced. She could only imagine who this camera belonged to and why it was left here, miles from civilization. It gnawed at her like an insistent itch, a puzzle she simply had to solve. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon as Molly stared longingly at the camera, yearning to unlock its secrets. Mike, eyeing his watch, decided to voice his concerns. "You're really fixated on this camera, Molly. You know we have to be careful out here." Molly looked up, a pensive expression on her face. "I know, Mike. I don't know. It feels like there's a whole story in here waiting to be told, and I need to hear it." Mike sighed, understanding the driving force behind Molly's compulsion. "Just promise me one thing, okay? Don't let it consume you." Mike's voice pierced through Molly's mental fog. She blinked and then nodded, mustering a faint smile. "I promise." Mike, satisfied with her answer, decided to share his input on the camera. Maybe there are some clues on it, something that can help you find its rightful owner. Molly brightened at the idea. She eagerly picked up the camera, examining it with a renewed interest. Chapter 2. Molly ducked inside the dingy confines of her tent, the worn-out nylon and faded poles a comforting beacon amidst the gloom of the dark forest. She unlaced her hiking boots, peeling off her damp socks and rubbing her aching toes. Michael poked his head in, his eyes filled with playful curiosity. "You all right?" he asked, amusement etched in the lines around his eyes. Molly glanced up and scowled good-naturedly. "Don't you start. I can take care of myself." Molly grumbled, unzipping her bag to pull out her laptop and camera charger. She'd promised she'd be careful, and she meant it. Michael grinned, unable to conceal his mischievousness. "Wouldn't dream of questioning your abilities, Molly. Just remember there's no Wi-Fi or cell service here. You may not like what you find." Molly glared at him, but her lips quirked in a half-smile. Michael had a point. She knew better than to get caught up in her curiosity and overlook the dangers lurking in the wilderness. A shiver ran down Molly's spine, recalling the unsettling feeling of being watched as she'd ventured through the dense woods. But the camera, the tantalizing mystery it represented, called to her all the same. Plugging the camera into her laptop, Molly watched as it sputtered to life, the screen flickering before displaying a thumbnail for a single video file. "Well, here goes nothing," she murmured, her voice barely audible as she clicked on the file. The video started with a clumsy handheld pan of the area around the camera's location. Typical holiday snaps, Molly thought. But the atmosphere began to shift as the video progressed. Sudden, sharp movements made her wince, but as her eyes flicked back and forth, searching for something recognizable, her curiosity deepened. The footage changed. A figure darted suddenly onto the screen, wearing a desperate expression. A chill ran down the spine of Molly and Mike in unison. The person, a young woman, sprinted frantically through the dense underbrush of the forest. Heart pounding, Molly clutched the edge of her sleeping bag. "Keep watching. Maybe you'll learn something about the camera's owner," Mike advised grimly. As Molly and Mike watched on, the young woman appeared again on the screen, ducking behind a tree in the distance. But this time, a few moments later, something else darted into view. A flash of something dark and imposing. Molly caught her breath. What on earth could that be? Her eyes darted back to the young woman hiding behind the tree. She trembled, crouched low. Fear rippled from the screen. The figure crept closer, its form barely distinguishable. Suddenly, the person on the run emerged from her hiding place, legs pumping, gasping for breath. It was getting dark, making it difficult to see what was unfolding right in front of them. Molly could hardly believe her eyes as the figure sped into the distance, barely evading its pursuer. The darkness enveloped the forest like a cloak, making it more difficult for Molly to see what was unfolding on the screen. "We need to find a light," Molly muttered, her heart hammering in her chest. Michael hastily rummaged through his backpack to find a flashlight, his hands trembling with the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Flicking it on, he conveyed the dim light to the laptop screen, allowing them to grasp the gravity of the situation. The figure, running like mad, continued dodging behind trees. Molly's breath caught with every sharp turn, her pulse thrumming wildly. She couldn't help but feel responsible for the potential danger this woman, forever trapped in digital form, faced. "We have to do something," insisted, eyes glued to the tiny frame. Michael nodded slowly. "I know, but let's finish watching. Maybe there's an answer at the end." They watched as the noose tightened on the woman in the video. Despair filled her eyes, her desperate panted breaths echoing through the dark forest. Molly's heart nearly shattered at the sight, her fingers digging unconsciously into the fabric of her tent. Her resolve hardened. This woman's plight was now her concern as well. The video ended abruptly, leaving the women in the tent simultaneously relieved and filled with a newfound urgency. The search for answers became crucial. "What do we do now?" Molly asked, turning to gaze at Michael with pleading, imploring eyes. "We need to investigate," Michael replied, resolve evident in his steely voice. "We can't just leave her in danger like this." Turning back to the laptop, Molly studied the video timeline meticulously. Her finger hovered over the play button, poised to rewatch it if needed. She glanced at Michael out of the corner of her eye. From his eager expression, she could tell he shared her determination. "We'll search for clues first thing in the morning," Michael decided finally. Molly nodded fervently. "Absolutely," she agreed. "We can't risk setting off into the woods without a proper plan." The night grew colder and the wind picked up, sending a chill through the campsite. As Molly huddled within the confines of her tent, her mind buzzed with questions and theories. She couldn't shake off the nagging sense of responsibility she felt for the unidentified woman in the video. The ominous chatter of twigs snapped her back to reality, but it wasn't the sounds she expected. Molly sat upright inside her tent, squinting through the dark canvas as a warm glow rippled through the forest. "Mike?" she whispered uncertainly, nudging him awake. He stirred, a question written across his face. "Look outside." A dim, flickering lantern cast an eerie glow on the tangled foliage, as though by some miracle someone had braved the wilderness to seek them out. It's not a rescue party, is it?" Molly's question hung heavily in the damp, cold air. A stifled gasp escaped from her throat, the weight of the situation pressing down upon her like a dense fog. Michael scanned the perimeter of their campsite, his senses on high alert. "Hold on," Michael whispered urgently, before silently unzipping their tent and slipping out with the bare minimum of noise and light. Molly watched in stunned silence, her heartbeat quickening with every passing second. Crunching leaves and the faint sound of rustling through shrubs suggested that Michael had a visual on something. Molly held her breath and eased herself from her sleeping bag, tiptoeing towards the entrance of the tent. The mysterious source of light still burned in the distance, creating subtle shadows that punctuated the surrounding flora. Molly felt the fine hairs on her arms standing on end, forming a prickling sensation as she realized just how precarious their situation seemed to suddenly be. She had no idea what lay hidden in the depths of the woods, but her intuition whispered that they were intruding on someone's territory. Chapter 3. The dense evergreen labyrinth sprawled out before us, its pathways twisting and turning as if to deliberately elude us. Molly, ever curious and driven, took the lead with cautious steps on the damp forest floor. The scent of decay filled my senses, punctuated by the sporadic rustling of leaves, an eerie melody in the stillness that made my skin crawl. "Should we really be going back in there?" Michael asked, his voice barely audible over the crunch of leaves underfoot. He glanced at Molly, concern etched on his usually carefree face. "It's getting late, and these woods, they're not right." Molly paused, her gaze fixed on the tangled path ahead. "We've come this far," she said, determination hardening her voice. "We can't just leave without finding out what happened." She took a deep breath, the damp, earthy scent filling her lungs. "Besides, it's not like we have a choice. That footage, we need to know who those people were." Molly trudged forward with a grim determination, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. The initial trepidation that had knotted her stomach had dissipated, replaced by a burning desire. Mike nodded solemnly, a look of resolution settling on his face. "You're right," he murmured, falling into step with Molly. Together, they ventured deeper into the forest, the trees' shadows seeming to writhe around them like tendrils of darkness. Roots and branches snaked around their ankles, threatening to trip them at every opportunity. An unearthly stillness settled over them, and Mike gave voice to the prickling at the nape of both their necks. "Can you feel it? Something's not right." Molly felt the weight of the silence around them, every sound soaked up by the dense foliage of the woods. "I know what you mean," she whispered back, straining to hear anything other than their own raspy breaths. "But we have to keep going. We're so close to finding answers about that camera and its owner." The words fell heavily between them. They moved forward in a tense silence that grew heavier as dusk approached. The woods seemed to grow darker, swallowing up the last vestiges of daylight, leaving nothing but shadows that danced along the twisted branches overhead. Suddenly, Molly halted in her tracks. Mike almost collided with her. "Look! There!" she hissed, gesturing toward a faint, flickering light some distance away. Her heart thrummed wildly, and her skin crawled with a sense of foreboding. The promise of answers warred with the instinctive understanding that they were not wanted here. Moving closer, they soon realized that the source of the light was an isolated campfire, a beacon of warmth in this terrifying world of endless forests, leaves crackling underfoot. Silhouetted against the firelight stood 3 men, their rough and unshaven faces unreadable. Their posture was tense yet familiar, the lingering muscle memory of days spent hiking similar trails. Molly's chest tightened, her pulse quickening as realization washed over her. With cautious steps, she nudged Michael, setting him on edge. "They're hikers, or were hikers," she murmured, her whisper barely audible above the popping logs. Mike's gaze flickered from her to the strangers and back again. He nodded, understanding the stakes they now faced. They continued forward in silence, senses heightened and locked on to any potential movement in the surrounding forest, while their minds raced with a whirlwind of questions and possibilities. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the face of the 3 men as they huddled around the campfire. The embers glowed warm and orange amidst the encroaching gloom of twilight. Molly breathed a sigh of relief, yet she couldn't dispel the unease, settling over her like a shroud. These strange hikers, their faces obscured in the flames, shared a troubling connection with the footage they discovered. As they drew closer, a flicker of movement caught Molly's eye, and she instinctively tensed, her hand reaching for the pocket nearest to the small knife she carried with her. But it was only Steve, a fellow hiker who was unlucky enough to encounter bears during his solo excursion. His disheveled appearance and ragged clothes suggested a rough night in the wilderness. Molly shared a glance with Mike before plastering a warm, reassuring smile on her face. "Steve, right?" she asked as they approached the group, trying to mask her internal alarm system buzzing at full volume. One of the men, with a grizzled beard and furrowed brows, faced Molly, recognition clear in his eyes. "Yep, that's me," he offered tentatively, suspicion tightening his features. "And who are you guys?" Michael stepped forward, offering his hand to the stranger as a gesture of peace. "I'm Mike, and this is Molly," he introduced without delay. "We were nearby when we stumbled upon the abandoned camera and had come to investigate further." The man looked uncomfortable but returned a firm grip to Michael's outstretched hand. "I'm Dave, and these are John and Jim. We've had quite an adventure ourselves." John and Jim grunted in agreement. "We had to abandon our camp, and these words aren't exactly friendly to the uninvited," John added as Jim glanced warily around them. Molly's heart pounded in her chest as the conversation swirled around her, her thoughts racing just as the fire crackled beside them. The mystery of the abandoned camera suddenly seemed minuscule compared to the imminent danger surrounding them in this dense, ancient wilderness. Dave appeared conflicted for a long moment, his eyes darting between Molly and Mike. Eventually, curiosity won out. "We crossed paths with another hiker around the same time we lost our camp to wild boars," Dave shared. "She was a young woman, quite shook up. After we took her in for a while, she left without warning in the middle of the night." Molly's heart leapt as the description triggered a memory of the woman in the video. "What did she look like?" Molly asked, desperately trying to remain composed. Dave hesitated for a moment. She was petite, with long, dark hair that hung in tangles around her face. She had a distinctive scar on the side of her neck. It seemed to be causing her some discomfort. Molly felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "That sounds like the woman in the video, doesn't it?" she whispered, unable to suppress her excitement. Mike nodded his agreement. Chapter 4. Molly's heart raced like a timid deer at the words abandoned cabin. The weathered wooden structure, weighed down by the passing of unknown years, groaned under the creeping vines slithering up its walls. Michael, a best friend, looked sunken-eyed, his earlier laughter and light-heartedness replaced by pallor and apprehension. Molly couldn't help herself. They had to investigate that cabin. Molly's curiosity surged, obliterating any semblance of fear. The unidentified woman in the camera footage, as well as the mysterious men, deserved answers. Her heart slammed in her chest with every step as they approached the decaying structure, battling the tendrils of doubts clinging to them like wisps of smoke. The cabin's entrance stood agape, revealing the desolate interior. A pot-bellied stove, blackened by countless fires, hunkered in the corner. The rickety table, laden with stale crackers and empty tin cans, bore the brunt of their unease. As Molly carefully entered the dim room, The wooden floorboards protested underfoot, creaking with every cautious step. A mosaic of shadows danced on the walls, courtesy of the light sneaking through the broken windows, revealing dust motes, pirouetting in the quiet corner of the room. As Molly explored deeper into the cabin, the others trailed closely behind. The acrid stench of mildew and decay filled the air, stinging her nose with the weight of history. Papers strewn across the wooden table were filled with incomprehensible writing, Bibles with pages yellowed from age, and strange symbols decorating the covers. The symbols sent a shiver down Molly's spine, her hand clutching the camera as a nod to sanity. Since her parents had passed when she was a child, Molly had been fascinated by the occult and convinced that their deaths were linked to secret societies. Now she was confronted with a possible connection in this cabin. Molly stared at the strange symbols, comparing them against a worn-out book on her lap. "This can't be a coincidence," she murmured, fear and excitement warring within her. She glanced up at the others, who stared back in disbelief. Michael hesitated. "Molly, we can't stay. I know you want answers, but the darkness outside gets heavier by the second." "I don't want us stumbling in the woods without a clear idea of what we face," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice from trembling. He didn't want Molly to be swayed by his uneasiness, but the idea of the three strange men from the campsite lingered on the edges of his thoughts. Dave, John, and Jim stood somberly by the front door, still contemplating Molly and Michael's arrival. Dave's eyes narrowed as he considered the unexpected visitors, a mixture of suspicion and interest crossing his features. "Who are you people? What brings you here?" Dave finally asked, curiosity and caution vying for dominance in his tone. Molly cast a glance at Michael before taking a deep breath. "We're on a hiking trip, and we stumbled upon an abandoned camera along the trail, which led us to the cabin. The video footage on the camera mentioned your group." John's and Jim's expressions shifted to shock, realizing that their once concealed excursion was now revealed to outsiders. Dave, on the other hand, looked intrigued. "An abandoned camera, you say? The one that belonged to Mary?" His gaze shifted to the broken windows, contemplating the twisted vines that had overtaken the cabin. In that moment, it seemed as if the memory of her weighed upon him. "This Mary, was she the young woman who left in the middle of the night?" Molly asks tentatively, not daring to breathe. "We found some camera footage from her perspective, and, well, we wanted to find out what happened to her." The four of them stood there for a few moments, letting everything sink in. Dave's face, long ruled by a hint of sadness, softened considerably, a flicker of optimism sparking in his eyes. "Yes," Dave confirmed finally. "She was the same woman who camped with us. It wasn't until she vanished in the night that we realized something was terribly wrong." A hush fell over them, a heavy blanket of uncertainty draped across their shoulders. Michael and Molly exchanged worried glances. They knew all too well the sensation of helplessness when faced with something beyond their control. "What could have happened to her?" Molly asked. Dave lowered his gaze, contemplating Mary's fate and the consequences that now bore upon him and his friends. "She was part of our hiking group," he admitted. "But when we stumbled upon a fork in the road, she insisted on taking the less trodden path, while John, Jim, and we opted for the beaten trail." He paused for a moment, reflecting on the bitter taste of regret that lingered. She thought she could find a hidden waterfall. He continued bitterly. Mary's always been adventurous and rebellious, always wanting to find the next secret, the uncharted trail. Dave shook his head in regret, eyes dulled by his failure to protect her. But the truth is, we never saw her again after that fork in the road. She was gone, vanished without a trace. We searched for her nonstop, but there was no sign of Mary or the path she took. So we came back here, waiting, hoping she would return, but... Dave broke off, voice faltering. We didn't anticipate that you two would... Bump, bump. He glanced at Molly and Michael, uncertainty flashing briefly in his eyes. Find this place. Or find Mary. Molly tightened her grip on the camera, a sense of urgency washing over her as she weighed Dave's words. Suddenly compelled to share her own discovery, she hesitantly offered, "I might have some footage of Mary if you'd like to see it." Dave stared at Molly, his eyes reflecting a tumultuous storm of hope and fear. "Yes, please," he stammered. The silence stretched between them, the crackling embers of the fire the only sound piercing the darkness. Transitioning to a soft glow, Molly navigated her hands through her equipment, eventually retrieving the camera from her backpack. Carefully, with a trembling hand, she presented it to Dave. Hey. Unscrewing himself against the campsite tree and pressing play on the camcorder with a quivering finger, Dave accepted it reverently, projected the video on a ghostly replay of Mary's final hours. Dave, John, and Jim watched with horrified eyes as Mary walked deeper and deeper into the unknown, her confidence manifesting itself in her unwavering stride. Molly and Michael stood on the fringes of the campsite, a cold sense of dread growing in their stomachs as they observed the video play out. "Good God," breathed Michael, his eyes fixed on the strange cult symbols etched onto Mary's cave walls. "It looks like she stumbled upon their gathering." Molly nodded gravely. The chilling vision of Mary's encounter with the mysterious coven sent a shiver down both her and Michael's spines. Their eyes met, exchanging the subtlest of reassurances. Despite the mounting danger and the rabbit hole they'd fallen into, they'd uncovered the truth regarding this haunting affair. The footage revealed increasingly disturbing rituals performed by the members of the cult, and the desperation in Mary's voice was palpable. Molly and Michael exchanged worried looks as Dave, John, and Jim watched in horror. "My God, what have we gotten ourselves into?" Dave muttered under his breath, breaking the silence that had fallen among the group. John and Jim shook their heads, still staring at the now still image on the camera. Finally, the video ended with Mary tied to a chair, surrounded by the cult members, each wearing grotesque masks. Just as before, Mary's eyes pleaded for escape or salvation. Her voice cracked, fear seeping through the layers in her words as she screamed for help. It made Molly's stomach churn, knowing that they had arrived too late. The gruesome display and the despairing cries of a woman in dire need of rescue left the campers emotionally drained. Silence cloaked the group like a heavy fog, each individual trapped in a loop of distressing thoughts. Dave, John, and Jim stared at the ground in a tableau of regret as their earlier decision to part ways with Mary played on a perpetual loop in their minds. If only they hadn't taken the easier route and allowed her to explore the less trodden path, Perhaps she would have never been ensnared by the sinister grip of the coven. A palpable tension filled the air as a tangible weight grew, pressing against their shoulders. Molly, with raw determination etched onto her features, stood resolute amidst the chaos. "We have to do something," she declared, her anger fueling her newfound resolve. Dave glanced between John and Jim, silently seeking their assurance before replying. "We should contact the authorities. Report a missing person and hand over the footage." Reluctantly, John and Jim nodded their agreement, concern and dread etched onto their faces. Michael glanced at Molly, taking in her determination and focus. "Perhaps Mary could still be alive?" he offered gently, trying to meet her gaze and support her stance. But as Molly met his eyes, he saw something inside that scared him even more than the darkness creeping in from the forest. She believed that they could save Mary, as if it were their responsibility to atone for what had come before. Determined to help Molly in her quest, Michael nodded. "Yes, I'm sure she's still out there and needs our help." John shrugged. "But what can we do? We don't know who these people are or where they've taken her." Dave frowned, deep in thought. "We could try to follow the path that Mary took. Perhaps there are still traces that could help us find their gathering place." Jim scoffed. "Do you really think that's wise?" Chapter 5. As the group huddled around the fire, Molly, driven by a sudden surge of conviction, articulated her thoughts out loud. "Suppose we should follow the path in the footage." Contemplating their shrinking options, Michael reluctantly agreed, his usually bright eyes clouded with worry. "That's assuming we could even find it." Together with Dave and his friends, they studied the camera's display, mentally marking a mental map. The once lively campsite buzzed with an undercurrent of unease. Transfixed by the remnants of Mary's video, each member of the group grappled with a mixture of guilt, terror, and regret. Thoughts of what Mary experienced at the hands of the dark cult weighed heavily on their minds. A sudden hush fell over the group as Michael cleared his throat. "We'll divide and conquer," he proposed, voice surprisingly steady. He eyed Molly, attuned to her determined gaze that seemed to burn holes into the darkness. "We'll form an expedition team and seek out the path on the footage. The rest of you can head back towards civilization and contact local authorities to share the disturbing evidence we've discovered," Michael said, slowly outlining the plan as the fire crackled and snapped. In spite of his nerves, he adopted a steadiness in his voice that was reflected in the quiet agreement among the others. Glancing around, Molly observed the disparate group of hikers before her. Once contented, nature-loving individuals were surely shaken, their confidence rattled by the events that had unfolded as night settled over their encampment. Molly studied these faces she had so recently come to know as their expressions hardened, with a raw determination to see things through. Michael's own eyes met hers, filled with a quiet assurance. It was as if they had come to some secret agreement without saying a word. On the other side of the crackling embers, Dave, John, and Jim prepared to depart. They had elected to return to civilization at first light to report their findings, bringing the authorities back to this godforsaken place to put an end to whatever unholy darkness dwelled in these woods. As the campsite grew quieter, Molly glanced around, her eyes resting on Dave, John, and Jim, who sat together in somber contemplation. she found herself contemplating their weariness. Their once confident expressions had been replaced with fatigue and shadows, as if they carried the weight of a terrible burden upon their shoulders. Molly felt for them. After all, they had lost one of their own, and there was no guarantee that Mary could be found and also in rescue. Rousing herself from her contemplation, Molly forced her attention back to Michael. He looked at her, a hopeful expression in his eyes. She knew he wanted the best for her in this harrowing quest, and the thought of endangering her life weighed heavily on Molly. However, their mysterious past had instilled a deep sense of curiosity within her, which could not be silenced or tamed. "All right," Molly conceded, the words barely escaping her dry lips. "We part ways come dawn. No sense in prolonging this for everyone involved." The crackling fire cast an amber hue, throwing dancing shadows upon their weary faces, carving wrinkles of anxiety and sorrow. The five of them sat in almost complete silence, a testament to their collective exhaustion and fear. As hours passed, their makeshift camp gradually surrendered to the darkness, punctuated only by the occasional bursts of shooting stars and the restless shifting of branches. Molly could barely concentrate on the flickering campfire as her mind raced with vivid memories of her childhood and the insatiable curiosity that defined her. The feeling of responsibility for Mary, coupled with a need to confront her past, left Molly oscillating between resolute determination and paralytic indecision. Her focus kept returning to the memory of the cold, damp underground lair where they had discovered the video footage that ultimately led them to this campsite. She couldn't shake the images seared into her mind from those horrifying clips, especially the desperate cries of Mary, trapped amidst the dark cult's rituals. In the unfading darkness, Molly silently promised that she would find Mary and save her. John and Jim left the area in the pre-dawn hours, disappearing into the dense forest to contact authorities. Molly, Michael, and Dave remained behind, their plans laid out before them. As the first light of daybreak crept over the horizon, Molly steeled herself with a fierce determination. She had a good handle on the physical challenges they would face, traversing the treacherous terrain. But her greatest concerns were centered on the mysteries yet to unravel. "Are you ready?" Dave asked, naively trying to maintain his usual jovial confidence. He considered himself the logical one in the group, but he had to admit that they were treading on dangerous ground. Molly replied with a determined nod, her gaze never leaving his. "Yes, I think so, though we might need to go over some safety protocols. I don't want to fall into the same trap Mary did," she admitted, rubbing her eyes as the fatigue suddenly seemed to weigh even more heavily on her. "I hear you, Molly. We should get some rest and set out in the early afternoon with a fresh mind and spirit. I don't want us missing any crucial signs or trails," Dave suggested gently. Everyone agreed, recognizing the importance of sleep and a clear mind to navigate the unknown territory ahead. They made quick work of breaking down camp, Michael and Molly exchanging a glance of mutual understanding as they packed their gear. As the sun began to rise, the group set out with renewed purpose, following the path indicated in the footage. Michael led the way with Molly close behind, peppering Dave with questions about the trail conditions and possible dangers. Dave, despite his former blasé attitude, eagerly educated Molly on the mountain's landscape and the various pitfalls to watch for. The terrain shifted from lush forests to jagged cliffs, and occasionally the undergrowth thickened to make progress slow and arduous. The trio walked for hours, sweat trailing down their faces, gripping the occasional tree trunk or sapling to maintain balance as they tread on loose rocks and steep inclines. Molly took detailed notes on the environment, checking them off on her mental list of landmarks and features that matched Mary's footage. "It's not far now," Dave assured them, pointing towards a narrow path nestled amidst rocky outcrops. Molly looked up, shading her eyes from the sun that temporarily blinded her. The warm rays cast an almost otherworldly glow around the lair entrance, making it appear both beautiful and menacing. She hesitated for a moment, gripping her backpack straps tightly and taking in the panoramic view of the formidable mountain. The narrow pass was indeed in sight, though it looked far more daunting from this vantage point. Michael noticed her apprehension and offered a reassuring smile. "We've got this, Moll. As we've learned, expecting the unexpected is key," Dave said. "And from what I gather, there are lurking dangers ahead." As the ground grew steeper and more unstable, Molly couldn't help but focus on Dave's words. This trail wasn't like the ones they had grown accustomed to during their years of hiking, and she knew they needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Finally, with determination, they reached the narrow pass. Chapter 6. Hours had passed since the three of them found the mysterious owner. Not long after, the sun relinquished its fierce hold on the day, and the sky shifted into a delicate twilight hue. Molly and Michael's minds were still consumed with the horrors they witnessed on the camera and the condition of the owner. An eerie silence pervaded the air as they approached the desolate hospital in the distance. The towering edifice, with its once shining windows now blank and dull, appeared cold and abandoned. A chill ran down Molly's spine as she noticed the loose shutter rhythmically banging against the hospital's facade, accentuating the forlorn atmosphere. She looked back at Michael. "This is it, huh?" she asked, slightly out of breath from their hike downhill. A mix of weariness and anxiety etched on her face as they drew closer to the imposing structure. The distant call of nocturnal animals only heightening the sense of unreality. Michael pushed a loose strand of hair behind his ear, jaw clenched with unease. "Yeah, this is the place, and it looks like we've got some work to do." Determined to help the owner, Molly followed closely behind as Michael nudged open the rusty front door. An eerie stillness filled the air, the scent of dust and decay lingering oppressively, leaving a bitter aftertaste. The wind howled softly, creeping through the hospital corridors that were a labyrinth of shadows and darkness. The fallen pillars cast eerie silhouettes, while the ceiling sagged pitifully from neglect. A sense of foreboding washed over Molly and Michael as they stepped further inside the hospital. The eerie stillness was broken by the sound of an agitated woman's voice coming from a room down the hall. As they ventured deeper into the hospital, they encountered a room with a half-open door. Michael peeked inside and saw the owner lying on a blood-streaked mattress, writhing in pain. A row of shattered windows overlooked the overgrown courtyard, revealing dark clouds gathering ominously outside. Molly gasped at the sight. She couldn't believe that the owner was still alive, yet she was relieved that they had a chance to help. "Let's get her some help," Molly whispered. She sprinted to the nearest door that looked like it might lead outside and found a crumbling stairwell. She cautiously navigated down the narrow steps, hugging the grimy wall. It seemed like an eternity before the outdoor air greeted her senses. Michael followed closely behind, having made sure that the way ahead seemed relatively safe. As they emerged from the hospital ruins, the pair took stock of their surroundings. The velvet darkness of the night was touched with silver by the crescent moon, casting ethereal shadows. The trees swayed ominously in the wind, their branches laden with fresh snow. In front of them, Molly spotted a flat, snow-covered patch that appeared to serve as a clearing. The outline of what looked like a small cabin seemed to materialize out of the gloom. However, it was slightly run down and barely stood as a beacon of hope, nestled in this desolate landscape. Molly turned toward Michael, a glimmer of hope reflected in her eyes. "Can you check if there is any signal on your phone? We could use it to call for an ambulance." Michael nodded and rummaged in his backpack for his device. He flipped the screen open, the faint glow spilling onto his anxious features. A sigh of relief escaped him as he managed a single bar of signal strength. "We may just have enough signal to call for help," he announced, dialing the local emergency number. As the ringing echoed in the quiet night, Michael cast a nervous glance toward Molly, and then back toward the dark, eerie hospital. Minutes seemed to stretch on as they awaited a response to Michael's call. A sudden gust of wind swept past them, scattering loose snowflakes that danced in the air before dissolving into nothingness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a tinny voice responded through Michael's phone, inquiring about the emergency. Michael's words spilled out hurriedly, detailing their location and the dire state of the owner. The operator assured him that help was on its way and advised them to stay put until medical personnel arrived. A mix of relief and nervousness washed over Molly. She glanced at Michael, whose face was momentarily illuminated with a warm glow from the phone as he affirmed their circumstances to the operator. Molly's thoughts raced, oscillating between apprehension and a determination to get through the situation. She took in the desolate landscape before them, her senses heightened by the urgency of their mission. The rustling of leaves pierced the silence, accompanied by intermittent whispers from the wind that brushed through overgrown vegetation. Molly clung to Michael's arm, her grip firm but hesitant as the suspense weighed heavily on them. The constant samples of wildlife stirring in the distance only added to their unease. Moments later, they heard the distant wail of approaching sirens. Michael's face lit up as he watched the approaching flashing lights disappear around a bend. With no other choice, they embraced the warmth the approaching rescue team would bring and stepped out of the dark humorously. Molly felt the tension ease from her shoulder blades as she set her gaze upon the sight of the ambulance, its lights cutting through the darkness like swords. Finally, a semblance of hope pierced through the discomfort that had threatened to consume her. Two figures in uniform rapidly emerged from the emergency vehicle, inquisitive stares focused on Molly and Michael as they hustled closer. The paramedics, Aidan and Clara, dressed in thick coats, had the appearance of seasoned professionals, their faces etched with lines of both concern and determination. Clara's gaze shifted to Molly, her eyes taking in the dirt smeared on Molly's clothes and the weariness written across her features. "You two found her?" Clara asked, managing to combine both kindness and accusation within the same sentence. "Yes, we did. She's in the hospital, up there. It looks like she tried to make it out during a storm. Got lost, I suppose," Michael shared with them, the weight of the discovery plainly evident in his voice. "Noted, sir. Thanks for finding her," Clara confirmed, a slight smile crossing her lips as she typed a few notes on her notebook. "Thank God," Molly breathed. But her relief was quickly replaced by a deeper anxiety. "What do we do now?" she asked, her gaze moving from the approaching ambulance to the desolated hospital looming in the distance. "Let him take care of her, Michael assured her gently. Chapter 7. A somber silence hung in the air as the courtroom was emptied for a brief recess. The heavy, gilded courtroom doors swung closed, separating the defense and prosecution teams from the assembled spectators. As the sudden hush fell, Molly felt her heartbeat quicken, her palms damp with sweat. She glanced up at Michael, seated beside her, his expression mirroring her own fear and anxiety. As they shared a moment, their unspoken tension gave way just enough to be a wellspring of comfort for each of them. The judge, a stern-faced man in his 60s with a shock of silver hair, re-entered the now silent courtroom. His entrance drew murmurs from the onlookers as he settled into his sprawling oak chair. The stillness amplified Molly's heartbeat in her ears as she braced herself for the proceedings to commence. The judge acknowledged the parties present with a quick nod, and all eyes turned to the first prosecutor, an eloquent woman in her late 40s with fiery red hair. With a solemn air, she began the closure argument against the cult members, recounting the gruesome events that transpired, the unspeakable acts committed by the cult leaders, and the torture and death of multiple victims, including Mary, the hiker from Molly and Michael's initial trip. The courtroom spectators listened intently, their expressions one of shock and horror. Conversations erupted as everyone tried to process the appalling story. Molly's heart ached as she recounted the pain and fear in Mary's eyes from the camera footage. As the first prosecutor wrapped up her impassioned speech, a second prosecutor rose, detailing the evidence they had amassed throughout the trial. Their case solidified with witness testimonies, confession from some cult members, and, most significantly, the camera Molly discovered. Now it was the defense's turn. The lead attorney, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern, measured demeanor, rose to speak in support of the accused. He pleaded with the jury, painstakingly piecing together various loopholes and inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, ultimately painting a picture of the cult as misunderstood misfits, ostracized by society and manipulated by false allegations. As the defense made their closing arguments, Molly found herself wrestling with doubts about the cut's true nature. The attorney's carefully curated narrative offered a glimpse into their world, which prompted her to examine her own judgment. Meanwhile, Michael seemed transfixed by the attorney's every word as he meticulously studied the cult's members, whispering apprehensively to Molly, could they really be so innocent? The jury retreated to consider their verdict. Tension grew in the courtroom as time slowed to a crawl. Finally, after hours of discussion, the jury re-emerged. The foreperson's voice reverberated within the immense courtroom as they delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The response was immediate. The packed gallery erupted into cheers, tears, and applause. Many of the victims' family members embraced one another as they heard the words they so desperately desired. Molly and Michael exchanged relieved smiles, feeling as if they had finally accomplished their mission. As the courtroom erupted into emotions of joy, relief, and a sense of justice served, the judge banged his gavel to restore order. "Quiet in the court, please," the judge commanded. A hush fell over the room. Raising his hands for silence, the judge was quick to remind everyone that this verdict encompassed not just the cult members, but also those individuals who had yet to be found and arrested. With that realization, the families and friends of victims allowed themselves to feel a sliver of hope, for it meant that justice could still be served, even for the unaccounted. As the room cleared of onlookers and media, the defendants were led away, their faces betraying no remorse or reflection. The judge promptly adjourned the session, offering no words of consolation to those who had lost loved ones. Walking outside into the bright sunlight, Michael and Molly couldn't help but feel exhausted, the emotional whirlwind leaving them drained. But there was still one crucial piece of their mission left unfinished. They desperately needed to track down the remaining cult members and bring them to justice. As they approached their vehicle, Molly's phone buzzed in her pocket. Glancing at the screen, she saw the familiar name of Detective Garrett appearing. "Hey Molly, good news. We finally managed to track down one of the remaining cultists, and he's agreed to talk. He claims he knows where the rest of their hideout is." "This is our chance, Molly. We need to go now." Detective Garrett's voice pierced through the speakers, as urgent as ever. Molly looked at Michael with determination etched in her gaze. "You heard him, Michael. The sooner we leave, the quicker we can find the rest of them and put an end to this. I don't know about you, but I'm not stopping until we do." Michael gave a resolute nod, his face reflecting Molly's steadfast determination. "Let's get going then." "I'm right behind you, as always." Michael's support was unwavering, and Molly was grateful for his unyielding loyalty. She accepted the determination in Michael's voice, and with renewed vigor, they hopped into their car and sped off towards their next objective. The late afternoon sun had dipped just below the horizon line as they approached the mysterious location given by the informant. Dark clouds were slowly rolling in, an ominous warning of the incoming storm. The car's tires crunched against gravel as it wound its way up a narrow path flanked by towering trees. An air of foreboding blanketed the area, nature seeming to sense the ominous presence Molly and Michael were drawing nearer to. Their destination, a secluded farmhouse, loomed in the distance. A hollow sense of desolation emanated from the dilapidated structure, as if trying to stave off any who would dare disrupt its isolation. Molly glanced at Michael, her face expressionless yet determined. Their eyes met for a brief moment before she pulled the car to a halt meters away from the farmhouse. The ominous energy emanating from the building was palpable, but Molly was resolved. "We know they're in there," Molly murmured, primarily to Michael, but also perhaps to herself, trying to cement her resolve. "We can't let our guard down for even a second," Michael warned, firmly grasping Molly's hand in reassurance as they exited the vehicle in sync. They moved with caution, the crunching of gravel beneath their boots echoing in the eerie silence. As they approached the slightly ajar farmhouse door, an unidentifiable, musty odor wafted through the air, threatening to overtake Molly's senses. The darkness enveloped them, urging her to summon all her courage to take another step onto the porch. Michael carefully nudged the door open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The gloom obscured most details. Only shadows hinted at furniture that witnessed years of neglect. Molly's heart throbbed with her every breath as they cautiously ventured inside. A dim, flickering flashlight beam cut through the darkness, guiding their path. Michael trailed closely behind Molly, searching their surroundings with a familiar wariness. The walls whispered secrets of past atrocities, an oppressive silence filling their ears. In the depths of the building, faint, eerie creaks and crackles broke through the somberness. "Time's running short," Michael urged, his low voice barely audible over the wind howling outside. Molly nodded, her resolve unbroken. She pressed deeper into the house, her intuition urging her on even as her thoughts battled with fear. As they penetrated the heart of the farmhouse, they stumbled upon a room steeped in blood, the walls plastered with photographs of the victims they had fought to protect. They recoiled in horror, the reality of the crimes they were now confronted with weighing heavily upon them. "This is beyond what I expected to see," Molly whispered, her voice tinged with sadness and anger. Michael stiffened beside her, unable to find any words in this moment of overwhelming emotion. The pair stared silently at the evidence of the cult's heinous actions, now witnessing firsthand the true horrors they inflicted. Each image portrayed a soul robbed of life, a family torn apart by senseless violence, and a grim reminder that their work was still unfinished. Molly's anger surged, matching the intensity of the storm brewing outside. "We have to get these images to the authorities. We have to put an end to this once and for all," Molly stated firmly, her chest constricting with every word. Matthew nods in agreement, gritting his teeth as he snaps photos of the disturbing scene. They work swiftly and efficiently, driven by an unshakable sense of purpose. With a determination that mirrored the darkening sky outside, they collected photographs of the atrocities and packaged them safely in waterproof cases, preparing to return to civilization and give the evidence to law enforcement. As they ventured deeper, they stumbled upon personal belongings of the cult members, offering a haunting insight into their twisted lives. Molly observed with a horrified fascination, her mind racing as she connected the fragmented pieces of their harrowing journey to the cult's tangible remnants.